Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I know I'm from the house, but anyway, it's an honor to be here and be talking about. And I'm going to start my talk from a different scale, a bottom-up scale, not a top-down scale. And I want to show you a little bit of what we've been doing in the last few years, especially since I joined the university. So today I want to mention that this is a collection of work of all our research areas that we also teach in a group that was created in 2008, so about 10 years, 11 years. And I'm not only going to talk about the first two lines of research today, but there's a lot of exciting work and more optimistic, wonderful on biodiversity in the other two lines, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some not so optimistic way of seeing our landscapes and what has happened in the last few years. I'm going to talk about land use, deforestation, fragmentation, and also about fire, ecology, and geography, and all the research that we have been doing. When we started the group, or when I started that group and created the group, and I started a new landscape ecology research line at the National University, we started looking at the patterns and causes, drivers, why deforestation was happening in Colombia. So this was the beginning many years ago of trying to understand what was happening. So we started looking at the Amazon, and we'll come back to the Amazon in Colombia, but also at the national level. Why at the national, where, in which places, why was happening a deforestation very fast in some areas and why not in others? So we started looking at that in order to understand how the system was working. Whilst doing that, we started looking at policies already, so I think this is one of the frontiers of science that we should be talking about as well. And we already started looking at some of the efficiency of management, different types of management in Colombia. And in this case, for instance, this is just an example, but we're showing already 10 years ago that protected areas will always be very effective, not sufficient, but effective in halting deforestation in Colombia, also indigenous reserves, but already we were discussing the role of roads, creation of new roads, plans for new roads and deforestation in Colombia, and something that we have to talk about in some of the North Andean countries, which is illicit crops, because it has a lot to do with the dynamics in landscapes in Colombia. So we're sort of like studying these, but also looking at the buffer areas, the areas surrounding protected areas and indigenous reserves. And we already were showing some trends of a lot, you see the 80s, 90s, 20s, a lot of an increase in transform ecosystems around protected areas and indigenous reserve 10 years ago. We were already showing that there was something going on. It was very effective. Those areas were important, effective, but the pressure was coming. The pressure was coming from the outside, right? In any case, Susan already talked about the Amazonian fires in Brazil. Raise your hand, please. Who heard about fires in the Brazilian Amazon in the last few weeks? Right. Who heard about the Colombian fires last year? Who heard about the Colombian Brazil fires 10 years ago? This is something that it was building, so it's one of the frontiers as well, trying to do research that it's trying to, I'm not going to say forecast, but as researchers we were seeing that this was building up, and in Colombia as well, and you'll see 10 years, 15 years ago people were telling me I was wasting my time studying fires in Colombia, 15 years ago, and I'm very stubborn, so I kept studying it, and you'll see what I'm going to show you. Anyway, there's a debate about fire everywhere, but in the tropics particularly, because there's a debate about whether it's an ecological disturbance, whether it's an ecological catastrophe, or whether it's a useful land management tool, which is perhaps a bit of everything. So that's where we started trying to, while studying deforestation, fires starting to appear, and we started to look at all these questions about it. One of the first, and that's why I'm telling you, if you heard about fires in Colombia years ago, because this is one of the first examples, we started like measuring how much vegetation was being burned, how much was the area affected in Colombia, and how different were the different regions, because you know, as many of you know, and many of you are getting to know, Colombia has 5 very different regions in many terms, geographically, socially, environmental, and also with fires, because we started to measure. And sometimes I ask the question before I put this slide about how many hectares of vegetation do you think Colombia gets burned every year, and nobody gets it, because it's highly variable and actually is increasing. But anyway, at that time, we were already showing that it could be for almost 400,000 hectares per year, and years of El Nino, very dry conditions, could go up to 1 million hectares. A journalist once published that 1 million kilometers squares of Colombia were being burned because he made a mistake between hectares and kilometers. Colombia is about a little bit more than 1 million kilometers square, so that was a bit of an issue. But anyway, we started showing, and you see certain years where you see darker means more area being burned. And I'm not going to talk about carbon because not everything is about carbon, but I'm sure the speakers before could illustrate us about what the implications of carbon emissions are. But not only that, there's an association of fire with climate conditions. You burn things when they are dry, not when they are wet. So this happens in the landscape, and the drier the season, the more fire you're going to get because it's easy to burn. We'll talk about this later. We started to show that in the savanna regions of Colombia, the extension of the fires were much higher, so those fires are more extensive, they occupy a lot of area, but also in the Amazonia, Caribbean, and Andes, we were already showing that there was a lot of fires every year. But then we sort of start looking not only at the extension of the fires, but also at the number of fires and the size of fires. So it happens that already 10 years ago, we were showing that in the Amazonia, the fires were smaller, but there were more fires, more small fires everywhere. So in quantity, the number of fire, one event, was higher in the Amazonas. So that was intriguing. So then we started looking more about fires in the Amazon, particularly the link with climatic anomalies, but not only with climatic anomalies, which is starting to be more clear that the drier it is, the drier you're going to burn your vegetation, but also with deforestation. This is our contribution was in Colombia also to demonstrate years ago that fires were linked to deforestation in the Amazon, which is really in our Amazon, northwestern Amazon, the wettest part of the Amazon of the whole basin. This is really important because it has a lot of implications about all the biogeochemical, climatic, hydrological cycling. So we showed that and started studying this, but this was not enough. You start proving things where you keep finding questions and evolving about this. So what we did, it was a complex thing of trying to understand the role of fire with illicit crops, deforestation, pastures, and the dynamic so fast that happens in Colombia. Colombia, it's an example of rapid changing landscapes. So you cannot be, if you're not fast enough, you don't pick what's going on because things can change so fast. So we started looking at the complexity of what was going on. This is, for example, one of the colonization frontiers of the Colombian Amazon, and trying to understand in red fires, in pink, illicit crops. So we showed that the illicit crops had reduced considerably in this area, and also fire was had a role in the interannual dynamics, but not so strong. It depends in which area. So we started like contributing to understand these fast dynamics of yearly things happening. I wanted to prove that fire was being used for illicit crops cultivation, and in this case, we couldn't prove it because the illicit crops were getting smaller and smaller, so you don't do fires for that, or they don't do fires for that. Anyway, that was part of our question at that time. But again, we didn't stop. We still wanted to know not only deforestation, we wanted to know whether fragmentation, landscape ecology has a lot to do about patterns in the space, in the landscape. So we wanted to see whether there was a relationship between fires and fragmentation of forest. Not only deforestation, which is the total removal, but also fragmentation that leaves smaller fragments of forest, and a lot of what is called forest edge, the edge between forest and something else. If we imagine the Amazon as one big fragment of forest, we would think that the edge is only on the edge, but this is not the reality. When you go down scale, you find a lot of fragmentations and fragments and edges between things. So we started to also look at this, and I think this was one of the first studies that proved also that fires, and these two, for instance, are relating the number of fires with one metric in landscape ecology, which is edge, a number of fragments, more fires, more edge, more fires. So the fires do not occur in the middle of a fragment, in the middle of the Amazon. They mostly occur in the edge. So this was part of our contribution, but also linked with policy again and with management practice. This is an example of proving how protected areas, indigenous reserve, something that is called integrated district management, and outside Colombia, no category of special management, how much efficient were protected areas in stopping fires, again, because the fires do not occur in the middle, they come from the outside. Anyway, to add more complexity, and I'm not sure if my colleague Rafael from physics is here because he works in complexity, add the human dimension to all that. And that's some of what we do in landscapes and landscape ecology. So we did a few years ago with a colleague from Stony Brook, Liliana Davalos, Stony Brook in New York, a Colombian that works in Stony Brook in New York. We did a study trying to understand whether we were blaming wrongly cattle grazers in Colombia. And perhaps we had to start looking at something else behind the cattle growing industry. So in the past, in some of our papers, you will find that we were talking about pastures and cattle growing, etc. But then we started looking at land grabbing and how complex is some people that burn, and this has to do with fire all the time, burn because of they want to get more land tenure, properties, etc. So not because they're going to do a business of bringing cattle. So they cut, they put pasture, perhaps they put one cow, 2 cows, but it's nothing to do with the business. So the demand for beef and the price for beef was not related with what was going on in the conversion of this forest in this colonization front. So it's complex. So you start looking at things and it's difficult to stop. It's sort of like, it gets you more and more variables to understand what, especially in such dynamic landscapes as the ones we live. Also, we've been trying to do tools, another frontier of science, but tools for decision makers. That's why I call it a frontier of science, because seeing the situation, in this case, like I said at the beginning, I'm showing you the most worrying part of our work because there are other things more exciting and nice, but trying to predict, for instance, deforestation, trying to provide tools to forecast deforestation before it happens, so that the decision makers can do more things or be more prepared to do things. So we've done this. For instance, we developed this model for predicting deforestation in the Amazon, using fire information from satellite, near real-time satellite data. And it did really improve a lot some of the official forecasting, official data that some of the official institutions provide us with. But we've also contributed to Latin America. We're not only in our group from the National University, we also do things that contribute at the regional level and at the global level. And one of the examples I want to show you is not all forests are the same. Sometimes we get the figures of deforestation and forest, no forest, and it happens that not all forests are the same. So it's important to understand the different deforestation rates of different types of forests. This is an example of Atlantic forest, tropical dry forest, tropical forest, lowland forest, tropical mountain forest, seeing the difference that the forest deforest at different rates for different reasons in different countries. So we've contributed to this type of studies, and also getting back to our Amazon, because this is how I want to get to the end of the talk. I'm not finishing yet, but we're getting there. We've also looked at northwestern Amazon. Northwestern Amazon is, like I said before, is the wettest part of the Amazon basin, so it's really important to understand what's going on. We started looking at the role of roads, rivers, accessibility, fire, fragmentation in the northwestern part of the basin, and seeing that even sharing the same biome, the human influence is very strong and very different between neighbors. So it is clear that roads increase deforestation in mostly all countries, but in some countries, and rivers also, the accessibility through rivers is also a factor of deforestation and fires. But in Ecuador and Peru, it's more, or it was at the time of that research, it was more linked to oil infrastructure, whilst in Colombia, it was pasture development, or conversion of forest to pastures, and in Venezuela, for instance, it was agriculture. So we started like, wow, so similar but so different at the same time, and this is important for any decisions at the regional level. We also start looking at, or publish in this case, the difference between the periods when the fire season happens in different countries. It's not the same. Now we are hearing about Brazil because it's the fire season in Brazil. But in the north of the Ecuador, or the northern part, the fire season begins or the peak of the fire season is December, January, February, whilst in Brazil is now in August, September. So that's why we're hearing, and hopefully we won't have news about fires this year in our Amazon. Anyway, trying to also forecast, provide tools, again, what I think is one of the frontiers of what we scientists should do for society is trying to construct scenarios, like, again, not predict it, because it's difficult to predict, but at least to make people think about what can happen in wherever we live. So this is an example of scenarios that we developed for northwestern Amazon, in this case only for Colombia. And we started looking at particularly fragmentation and institutional and political factors, because we thought it was, after all, the background of understanding how things work, happen, the differences, how fast they change. We also wanted to see what else can we sort of like put in the discussion for making decisions in the Amazon. So in any case, that's why I say that this is sometimes a bit depressing, because no matter what the scenarios, we develop 3 different scenarios. What is called business as usual, which is in the left, business as usual, same things go the same way. Well, why don't we stop and at least make a decision to stop half of the conversion of forests to pastures? The government makes some policies that do that. And the other is the more optimistic, which we call technical. Let's stop completely the conversion of forests to pastures, but use what is already there to do all these productive activities that might be related to economic human development. No matter which one you look, if you see this yellow is the conversion, well, mostly pastures. No matter which one you look, there's a division of the Amazon in coming soon for us in Colombia. The northern part of our part of the Amazon, in the northern and the southern part of the Amazon, will be soon divided, and this has a lot of implications for biodiversity, connectivity, ecosystem services, and loss of species. And also the Andes. The Andes is going to be disconnected of the Amazon, particularly in this part of our country. And you see in slash lines the protected areas. They're also being threatened. Even though I showed you before that they were effective, they're not enough. The threat is coming. And some of these, no matter which scenario you look, some of the areas have a strong pressure and will be under serious problems soon. However, even if we try to be fast and be up to the changes, fast-changing things that happen, reality sometimes overpasses us. And this is the reality of what happened. That's why I was asking you whether you heard about fires in Colombia last year. Because this is an example of 1 year after the peace agreement in Colombia, there was a peak, 8 times increase of fires inside protected areas, in the areas where the guerrilla was present before the peace agreement. So this is very complex, because and we predicted what was going to happen last year in deforestation in the protected areas in the Amazon. We did predict it before it was measured and officially on the news and all these photographs and flying over, etc. We predicted it. So this is something that is really sometimes frustrating, but I think this is the frontier of science. Just to show you the depressing aspects, just 1 minute to talk about the Amazonia fires, because there's been a discussion about the Amazonia fires in Brazil. I just want to show you that this is the daily number of fires over Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon, and 2019 is on the path to surpass the worst year ever since we monitor fires in the Amazon. This was Brazil, and this was produced in my lab by one of my master's students yesterday. So apologies for the quality of the graph, but this is showing, Colombia is not this year following that, but we haven't started the fire season yet. However, if you see, 2018 was bad, 2007 and 2004 related with climatic region was bad decrease. So we don't know what's going to happen. Perhaps it's not this year going to be bad, but we don't know. But in any case, it's good to compare. Finally, just to show you some illustration of some of the ground sites we are working on, some pictures of fires being affected by fire, a forest affected by fire. This is some drone images. This is in the Orinoco Basin. This is in the oak forest. This is unburnt, non-affected oak forest in the Andean Mountains in Iguaque, those that know. This is the conditions that we get after one fire affects that. No, it has, again, not only to do with carbon, but it has a strong implication of what happens. And also, I have students doing this kind of work. They're looking at what a fire does on fauna, for instance, in different groups. This is an example of some preliminary studies of one of the PhD students showing that even if it's very close, a forest that is affected by fire changes the composition of small non-flying mammals. Another frontier, and I'm going to finish. This is the frontier also, trying to communicate science, trying to communicate. Sometimes it's harder for scientists to do that. And this is my final frontier, action on policy and decision-making. Last week, we started as a research group with my students. We went a year ago to the House of Representatives, to the politicians in Colombia. We started discussing a bill on forest fires, and last week it was, I don't know if the word is filed, but it was stamped and initiated the process as a future law of forest fires, about forest fires in Colombia, which I think it's another of the frontiers we should be discussing, how to bring our research to the real decision-making. And this is an effort, voluntary, nobody paid us, all the students. You see many of my students, I was teaching, so they went to the House of Representatives with a bill that was passed, and you can see it there. These are a group of people, of students that have been around, and this is the list of the current students, because without them, I can tell you that we wouldn't be doing all these important or interesting or depressing sometimes work. So partners and funding, a lot of people, I'm probably forgetting many, and I'm hoping to build really strong relations with Germany after this session. So sorry about if I passed my time. Thank you.